Welcome to Soft History Stories. 32. That's all there is. Not hundreds, not thousands, just 32 mysterious symbols. Yet they appear again and again, etched into caves in France, carved across Spain, painted in South African rock shelters, and scattered across an Ice Age world separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. And yet there they are, the same marks, the same shapes, lines, dots, triangles, spirals, lad-like grids, a strange W shape, something that looks almost like a hashtag, over and over and over again. Now, if this were just a handful of sites, you could chalk it up to coincidence. Humans are pattern-making creatures. Maybe early people just independently landed on similar doodles the way kindergartners everywhere draw the same lopsided sun. But that explanation starts to fall apart when you actually look at the data, because these aren't random scribbles scattered randomly across cave walls. They're specific, they're repeated, and in some cases, they appear to be deliberately placed in particular locations inside caves that required serious effort to reach. Dark, dangerous, deep inside the earth where no one was living, where no firelight naturally reached. Someone went in there specifically to put those marks in those spots. So, the obvious question, the one that keeps researchers up at night and has started genuinely heated arguments at archaeology conferences, is what are they? What were they for? Are we looking at pure decoration, the Ice Age equivalent of doodling on a notebook? Are we looking at some kind of tallying system, early humans counting things, tracking things, maybe seasons or animal migrations? Could they be ritual shorthand symbols tied to shamanic practice or spiritual belief systems we can barely begin to reconstruct? Or, and this is the question that really lights up the conversation, could we be looking at something much more significant? Could this be the earliest recognizable attempt at a writing system, humanity's first real language of symbols? That last possibility sounds almost too dramatic to take seriously. We generally think of writing as something that appeared around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, clay tablets, cuneiform, the birth of recorded history. But the symbols we're talking about here go back 40,000 years. Some researchers argue even further. If even a fraction of what's being suggested holds up under scrutiny, it would completely rewrite what we think we know about the cognitive lives of our Ice Age ancestors. And look, this is exactly the kind of question where the evidence gets complicated fast, because we're not dealing with a Rosetta Stone situation here. There's no bilingual key, no inscription that bridges the gap between these marks and any meaning we can directly verify. What we have is pattern, repetition, context, and very careful statistical analysis. And depending on how you weigh those things, depending on which framework you bring to the evidence, you can arrive at very different conclusions. So that's what this is going to be. We're going to look at what these 32 symbols actually are and where they appear. We're going to dig into how researchers date Ice Age cave art and why that dating is messier than most people realize. We're going to talk about placement, about what counts as writing in the first place, about the leading theories ranging from lunar calendars to hunting databases to shamanic ritual maps to prehistoric mnemonic systems. And we're going to be honest about where the evidence is solid, where it's speculative, and where the science is genuinely still unsettled. Because here's the thing, this mystery is real. The 32 symbols are real. The debate around them is real. And the implications, if any one of the stronger interpretations turns out to be correct, are almost impossible to overstate. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is there. I genuinely check those, and there is something almost poetic about people from completely different corners of the planet tuning in to think about marks made by humans who wandered ice, Tage landscapes, 40,000 years ago. Berlin at midnight, Sydney at breakfast, someone on a night shift in Sao Paulo. All of us connected to the same ancient mystery. Tell me where you are, and if you want to listen without any ads or background music, completely clean audio, you can follow this on Spotify. The link is in the description, and it genuinely helps keep this going. Alright, let's go back to the caves. Way back to the flickering torchlight, and the cold stone walls, and the 32 marks that somebody a very long time ago decided were worth making permanent. So, let's start with a basic distinction that matters more than it might seem at first. When researchers talk about Ice Age cave art, they're really talking about two fundamentally different categories of things. On one side you have figurative images: horses, bison, mammoths, aurochs, deer, the occasional human figure. These are recognizable representations of the world, pictures of things that exist. On the other side, you have what archaeologists call signs, non-figurative marks, abstract geometric shapes that don't obviously represent anything from the natural world. And it's this second category, the signs, that's at the center of everything we're about to explore. What do these signs actually look like? Think dots, single dots, rows of dots, clusters of dots, arranged in patterns, lines, both single and bundled together like a handful of sticks, triangles, zigzags and chevrons, spirals, cross-hatched grids that look almost exactly like a modern hashtag. Shapes that researchers have named things like claviforms, which are roughly club-shaped marks with a rounded head on a narrower stem. A-forms, which have a vague wing-like or bird-like spread to them. Techiform, which look like little tent or roof shapes. Penniform, which resemble feathers or leaves. And then there are the ones that don't map onto anything familiar at all. Combinations of lines and curves that feel like they're almost spelling something in an alphabet you've never seen. Now, here's where the 32 number comes from. And it's worth being precise about this, because the claim has sometimes been reported in ways that are slightly misleading. The researcher most associated with this finding is Jenevon Pettinger, a Canadian paleo-anthropologist who spent years systematically cataloging signs from Ice Age sites across Europe. What she found working through the records of hundreds of sites, spanning roughly 30,000 years, of human history, was that the total repertoire of distinct geometric sign types used across all of these sites appears to converge on a surprisingly small number, around 32 recurring forms, not 32 signs at any single site. Not 32 equally common signs, but 32 identifiable types that together seem to account for the vast majority of the non-figurative marks found across the European Ice Age record. That's a striking constraint. Think about what it would mean if early humans were just spontaneously making random geometric marks with no shared conventions. You'd expect huge variation. Every region would develop its own idiosyncratic shapes, and the overall catalogue would sprawl into the hundreds. Instead, what the data suggests is a bounded repertoire, a limited set of forms that get used again and again across enormous geographic distances and across tens of thousands of years of time. That's not nothing. That's actually a pretty significant pattern. But how do you even classify these things? This is where it gets genuinely complicated. An archaeologist will tell you the arguments about this are not trivial. Classification requires decisions. Is this mark a simple line or the beginning of an angle? Are these two dots one symbol or two? Is this curved shape the same sign as that slightly different curved shape from a cave 400 meters away? Or are they distinct? The criteria researchers use to define and group sign types are necessarily somewhat subjective, which means the exact count depends partly on methodological choices. Some researchers working from different frameworks arrive at somewhat different numbers. The 32 figure isn't a hard physical factor, like the boiling point of water. It's the output of a careful but human-constructed classification system. And that matters when we're evaluating how strong the evidence actually is. What's also important to understand is that these signs don't typically appear in isolation. They appear in context. On a cave wall, you might find a charging bison, rendered with remarkable naturalistic skill. And right next to it, apparently deliberately placed, a series of dots or a claviform or a row of lines. Hand stencils made by pressing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it appear at many sites alongside these geometric marks. Sometimes the signs seem to interact with the animal images placed on or near them in ways that feel intentional. Sometimes they appear in areas of the cave that have no animal imagery at all, just signs clustered together in patterns that suggest deliberate arrangement. The compositions are varied enough that no single explanation accounts for all of them, which is itself a clue that these marks were probably serving more than one function, or that the function shifted and evolved across thousands of years and thousands of miles of cultural difference. And here's the tension at the heart of everything. The repetition of these forms across such vast spans of time and space strongly suggests some kind of convention, a shared understanding when the same specific shape shows up in a cave in the Dordogne region of France, and at a site in Calabrian Spain, and at a rock shelter in southern Seneca, and it keeps appearing across tens of thousands of years. It becomes harder and harder to explain that away as coincidence or independent invention. Conventions by definition are shared. They exist between people. They imply communication, transmission, a social agreement about what a particular form means or represents. But, and this is a significant but, convention is not the same thing as language. It's not even the same thing as writing. We have plenty of conventional symbols in human culture that aren't language in any meaningful sense. Corporate logos are highly standardized and instantly recognized across vast distances. Religious symbols like the cross or the crescent appear consistently across enormous cultural territories. Heraldic designs follow strict conventions. None of these are writing systems. They carry meaning. They encode information, but they don't constitute a language in the technical sense that linguists use. So the mere fact that Ice Age people seem to have shared and transmitted a constrained set of geometric forms doesn't by itself tell us what those forms were doing. It tells us that something was being transmitted. Something was being maintained across generations and across geography with enough fidelity that the shapes stayed recognizable. That is genuinely remarkable. It implies cultural continuity, teaching, probably long-distance contact between groups. But the nature of what was being transmitted, the actual content of these marks, remains stubbornly opaque. What makes this especially fascinating is the chronological spread. The earliest signs in the European record appear to go back at least 40,000 years, possibly further to the very beginning of what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic, the period associated with the arrival of anatomically modern humans in Europe. But some of the same sign types appear in African sites that may be significantly older, a detail we'll come back to because it raises some very interesting questions about where this tradition actually started. And on the other end, these signs persist and evolve for tens of thousands of years, getting more complex in some ways, spreading into new regions, appearing in new combinations. That's a lifespan that dwarfs all of recorded history. Every writing system we know of, uniform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Chinese script, the Phoenician alphabet, all of it together covers maybe 5,000 years of human history. We're talking about a tradition of geometric marking that may have persisted for 8 times as long, either as a remarkably durable set of cultural conventions or as something else entirely, something we don't yet have a good name for. So when researchers talk about the 32 symbols, they're really pointing at a pattern that demands explanation. A constrained repertoire shared across impossible distances, maintained across impossible timescales, appearing consistently enough that it cannot be hand-waved away, but resisting interpretation stubbornly enough that we still can't say with confidence what any individual mark actually meant to the person who made it. That gap between pattern and meaning is exactly where this whole debate lives, and filling it requires us to look very carefully at where these marks appear, what they appear alongside, and what the deep structure of their distribution might be telling us, which means we need to go to the caves themselves. If you open almost any popular book or documentary about Ice Age art, you'd think this whole story takes place in a handful of famous caves in Western Europe. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, legendary, yes. But they're just the tip of a much bigger, messier iceberg. Archaeologists talk about a region they call Franco-Antabrian Europe, that's basically southwestern France plus northern Spain, sliced through by the Pyrenees, but culturally more connected than divided. This is the densest cluster we know of, hundreds of caves and rock shelters, many with both animal figures and those abstract signs. In the Dordogne, in the Vézère Valley, in the Périgord region of France, you get places like Lascaux, Font-des-Aumes, and Ruffinac. Cross the mountains into Cantabria and Asturias in Spain, and you hit Altamira, El Castillo, Tito Bustio. If you're looking for where the 32 signs have been documented most systematically, this is ground zero. When researchers like von Pettinger compiled their catalogues, the majority of their data points came from this Franco-Antabrian belt. You see dots, lines, clav forms, tectap forms, pen forms, hand stencils, all playing out in different combinations from cave to cave, valley to valley. Some caves are like encyclopedias of the repertoire. Others are surprisingly minimalist, maybe just a handful of signs and no animals at all. Move beyond that core though, and the picture spreads. In the rest of Western Europe, you find decorated sites scattered from Portugal to Italy to the Alps. Southern France has important complexes in the Ardèche and Rannes regions. Northern Spain extends eastward into the Basque country and Navarre. Italy has sites in Apulia and Sicily. There are decorated caves in Germany, Austria, even up into Britain during the warmer interludes when ice sheets retreated. The same broad family of sign types keeps popping up, but not in a uniform way. This is crucial. It's not like every one of the 32 signs appears everywhere, all the time, in a nice, even distribution. Some sign types are heavily concentrated in particular regions and time periods. Others are rare, almost like local dialect words that only show up in one valley. Take tectap forms, those little roof or tent shapes. They're especially associated with certain French sites, and even there, they're not spread evenly. Or clav forms, the club-like shapes, very common in some Dordogne caves, practically absent elsewhere. Dots and lines are everywhere, but that's almost cheating. Dots and lines are the simplest marks you can make, so when people say these 32 symbols appear worldwide, we need to slow that claim down a bit and ask what worldwide is actually doing in that sentence. In the strict quantitative sense, the well-documented 32 sign repertoire is a European phenomenon tied very specifically to the Upper Paleolithic, the period from about 50,000 to 12,000 years ago, give or take. Within that window, a lot of the famous Franco-Antabrian caves cluster between roughly 40,000 and 15,000 years ago. Chauvet at the earlier end may push back toward 37,000 years or more. Others like Lascaux sit around 217,000 years ago. Still others, especially in northern Spain and the Pyrenees, are even younger, approaching the end of the Ice Age. The deeper you look, the more you see waves, not a flat line. Certain sign types spike in particular periods, then fade. Some seem to be invented, spread, and then fall out of use, while a few stalwart shapes, dots, lines, simple angles, just keep going. Worldwide enters the conversation when people notice that some of these geometric motifs have analogies far outside Europe. You see series of dots, simple ladders or grids, zigzags, chevrons, hand stencils, and other basic shapes in Upper Paleolithic sites, in Russia and Siberia, in Southern Africa, in Indonesia, in Australia, in the Americas. There are red hand stencils in El Castillo in Spain, and there are red hand stencils in Sulawesi in Indonesia that are almost as old. There are cross-hatched engravings on pieces of ochre from Blombo, cave in South Africa, that predate European cave art by tens of thousands of years. So, one way to tell the story is, humans everywhere seem to converge on a limited set of simple, geometric marks when they start doing symbolic things on rock, lines, dots, chevrons, lozines, cross-hatching. If you define your categories broadly enough, any parallel lines, any grid-like pattern, you can absolutely say that similar motifs show up on multiple continents over very long time spans. That's the sense in which people sometimes describe this as worldwide. But there's a second, stricter sense, and this is the one that matters. If we're asking whether this was a single symbolic tradition, maybe even a kind of proto-writing, in that sense, you're looking not just for vague similarity, but for consistent, specific shapes, used in comparable ways, embedded in comparable contexts, over a defined period. And there the strongest case is still within Europe, across the Upper Paleolithic, with hints and precursors in Africa, and possible parallels in other regions that are suggestive, but not obviously the same tradition. Another layer to this is time. The Upper Paleolithic is not a single moment. It's more than 30,000 years of history. If you compress that to the scale of written history, it would be like lumping ancient Sumer, classical Greece, imperial Rome, medieval Europe, the Renaissance, and the Internet age into one undifferentiated period and expecting cultural continuity. So when we say these signs persist for 30,000 years, we're actually talking about multiple pulses of use across many generations of people who would not have recognized each other's languages, myths, or customs in any simple way. The fact that some sign types span that whole arc is extraordinary, but it doesn't automatically mean every group in that span was using them for the same thing. This is where mobility and contact become essential. Ice Age hunter-gatherers were not sedentary villagers. They moved seasonally and over lifetimes, often across hundreds of kilometers. Groups followed herds, tracked plant seasons, shifted routes as glaciers advanced and retreated. They met neighbors at shared hunting grounds, salt licks, flint outcrops, river crossings. Genetic and archaeological evidence from this period points to what you might call a braided landscape of human groups. Bands of a few dozen people nested within wider social networks that stretched over large regions. You don't need anything like global communication to explain how ideas move in that kind of world. You just need local contact repeated over centuries. A new way of organizing dots around an animal could travel the same way a particular spheroid design does. One group sees it, adopts it, modifies it, passes it on. Over thousands of years, a motif could move from the Atlantic coast deep into continental Europe without any individual ever walking that entire distance. At the same time, we have to remember that our map of this symbolic universe is radically incomplete. The caves we know best are the ones that survive, are accessible, and have been excavated and documented by modern science. Limestone preserves paintings well. Deep caves that were sealed by rockfalls or sediment are like time capsules. Shallow rock shelters erode. Open-air sites weather away. Wood and bark and skin don't usually last tens of thousands of years. On top of that, there's a huge sampling bias built into our research history. Lascaux and Chauvet became famous. That fame attracted funding, equipment, interdisciplinary teams. They've been documented down to the millimeter, but there are countless smaller shelters, many with only a few engravings or a handful of faded signs that have barely been surveyed, if at all. Eastern Europe, much of Asia, large swaths of Africa and the Americas are still drastically underrepresented in detailed sign catalogues compared to southwestern France and northern Spain. So when we say these 32 signs occur at X% of sites, so really saying they occur at X% of the sites we've found in the regions we illy at heavily studied with the classification systems we're currently using. That's still meaningful, but it's not the same thing as a full census of global Ice Age symbolism. Put all of this together, and the picture gets more nuanced. There is a recognizable repertoire of geometric signs in Upper Paleolithic Europe, especially in the Franco-Antabrian region. Some of those forms have suggestive parallels in Africa and elsewhere, both earlier and later. Their distribution is patchy in space and time, clustered in certain caves and phases, almost absent in others. Ideas could have spread through ordinary human mobility and local contact over many generations without any need for a planet-wide symbolic conspiracy. And yet, even after we account for bias and gaps, the pattern doesn't disappear. The same oddly specific shapes keep coming back in different caves, in different centuries, in association with different animals and different compositions. To get any closer to what that might have meant, we have to look not just at where the signs are, but at when they were made and how we know those dates at all. If we're going to talk about whether these marks form anything like a continuous system, maybe even a proto-writing tradition, the timeline matters a lot. You want to know, Did people in one valley actually inherit these signs from their great-grandparents, great-grandparents? Or are we accidentally lumping together things that are separated by 10,000 years and treating them like one conversation? That's where dating comes in. And dating Ice Age cave art is awkward. It's not like a modern mural where someone scribbles Banksy 2009 in the corner. Cave artists didn't leave timestamps. What we have instead is a toolkit of methods, each telling part of the story, each with its own blind spots. When you see a nice clean date in a museum caption around 32,000 years ago, that's almost always the polished tip of a very messy iceberg of uncertainty and argument. Start with the most famous method, radiocarbon dating. If the artist used charcoal, burnt wood or bone, either as a black pigment or in torches that smoked on the ceiling, we can try to date that carbon. Radioarbon works because a radioactive form of carbon, carbon-14, decays at a known rate. While a tree is alive, it keeps taking in fresh carbon from the atmosphere. When it dies and burns, the clock starts. Measure how much carbon-14 is left in the charcoal. Compare it to how much there should have been at the start. Run it through a calibration curve, and you get an age. When you have a clean charcoal line that you're sure belongs to the drawing, this can be incredibly powerful. It's how Chauvet's paintings shocked everyone by coming out older than expected, pushing detailed figurative art back into the Orinian. It's how we know some Spanish hand stencils hover around 3,000 years ago. But there are at least 3 big caveats. First, you're dating the charcoal, not the act of drawing. If a hunter burns a pine branch, tosses the half-used stick into a hearth, and 1,000 years later, someone else fishes a fragment out and uses it to sketch a bison, radioarbon will give you the age of the wood, not the moment of the sketch. Usually that gap is small, but with dead wood or reused fuel, it can in theory be large. Second, contamination is the enemy. Radioarbon needs incredibly tiny samples. Scrape a thin line of pigment. Mix it with even a small amount of modern carbon from conservation chemicals, fungal growth, even careless breathing and touching, and your dates skew younger. Old carbon from cave soot or carbonate dust can skew things older. Labs are obsessively careful, but early work from the mid-10th century wasn't always up to today's standards. Some classic dates have been quietly retired or heavily revised. Third, most cave art isn't charcoal at all. It's iron-rich ochre, manganese, engraved lines cut straight into the rock. Radioarbon can't do anything with pure mineral pigment. So, the method that feels most straightforward to the public actually applies to a minority of images, and often only where you'd willing to sacrifice a visible sliver of the artwork to sample it. So, archaeologists turn to the cave itself. One of the clever approaches is uranium-thorium dating of calcite, the thin crusts of limestone that water deposits over time. Think of those milky films and tiny stalactites that slowly grow on walls and ceilings. When calcite forms, it traps a bit of uranium, which decays into thorium at a known rate. Measure the ratio, and you get the age of that calcite layer. Here's the trick. Sometimes art is under the calite, sometimes on top of it, sometimes both. If you date a calite skin that lies on top of a red line, you get a minimum age. The painting must be older than that layer. If there's a calcite surface that was drawn on, and you can date that layer, you get a maximum age. The painting can't be older than the substrate. Bracket enough of these, and you start to narrow down windows. This method has produced some of the oldest proposed dates for European cave art, and for those famous Sula hand stencils in Indonesia. Suddenly, you've got red motifs that might be over 40,000, even pushing 60,000 years old. But again, there are catches. Calcite doesn't form everywhere, and even when it does, it's often patchy or full of microscopic impurities. The uranium-thorium system assumes the calcite was a closed system after it formed no later, water percolating through and rearranging elements. In real caves, water comes and goes. That can move uranium around and introduce thorium from outside, scrambling the clock. You also still aren't dating the pigment itself. You're dating the calcite that at some point grew over or under this mark. If the art and the calcite are close together in time, that's great. If there's a long gap, Your minimum or maximum age could be thousands of years away from the actual painting event. Because of those issues, uranium-thorium dates can be contentious. Tiny differences in which bit of kaolite you sample, how you interpret microlayers, or which corrections you apply can shift the results. Some early spectacularly ancient dates have been challenged, or at least hedged with wider error bars. When physics and chemistry run out of road, archaeologists lean on context. Stratigraphy is the simple idea that in undisturbed layers, older stuff tends to be deeper. In cave floors and entrance deposits, you might have hearths, tools, bones, and sometimes fallen fragments of painted wall or engraved blocks. If a decorated chunk is clearly sitting in a layer full of tools we know belong to, say the Gravettian, that gives you a rough cultural age for the art. This works better for portable art, and for shelters, where there's a clear sequence of human occupation. Deep galleries miles from the entrance often have no stratified floor at all, just rockfall and calite. Even where there are layers, burrowing animals, water action, and ancient digging can mix deposits. So stratigraphic arguments can be strong, but they're rarely precise down to a few centuries. You're often talking broad ranges, somewhere between 27 and 23,000 years ago. Then there's style. When people talk about the Chauvet style versus Lascaux style, they're noticing consistent ways of drawing, how horses' heads are shaped, how shading is handled, how certain signs cluster with certain animals. Over time, art historians built up relative sequences. This kind of naturalistic lion looks early, or this kind of elegant floating horse smells like mid-Megalian, and so on. Stylistic dating is useful. If you find an unknown cave whose bison look almost identical to bison from a site that are securely dated by radioarbon, that's a clue. If certain sign combinations only ever appear with late Magdalenian fauna elsewhere, and you see them here too, that's interesting. But style is also the most debated method because it packs in a lot of assumptions. It assumes that style changes in one direction more or less steadily, and that distant groups share the same artistic timeline. It assumes that people didn't unconsciously revive old fashions or keep conservative styles alive for ritual reasons. We know from modern art history that styles can loop, fragment, and deliberately reach backwards. Paleolithic people weren't any less capable of that. Add to all this the physical messiness of caves themselves. Rock faces sprawl, moisture seeps in, surfaces flake off, pigments fade, smear, and are accidentally touched or retraced. Sometimes later artists literally draw over earlier works. You end up with palips where 3 or 4 layers of images are sitting on top of each other. In some cases, one animal figure might be 15,000 years older than another that's just a few centimeters away. Conservation interventions from the 19th and early 20th centuries added another layer of trouble. People washed walls, traced outlines with chalk, lit acetylene lamps that coated ceilings with soot. All of that can confuse dating attempts, or even alter the chemistry of the surfaces we'd bored trying to analyze. So when someone shows you a neat diagram of Sin X appears from 34,000 to 19,000 years ago, remember what's under that line: a handful of radiocarbon points, some uranium-thorium brackets, a few stratigraphic anchors, and a lot of stylistic inference, all wobbling on top of geological and preservation quirks. Why does this matter for the writing question? Because writing in any meaningful sense is about continuity, evolution, and transmission. An alphabet isn't just some shapes that people draw. It's a system that gets passed down, modified, standardized, and used in sequences over time. To argue that the 32 signs form anything like that, you need to be confident that when you see a specific ladder sign here and a similar ladder sign there, they're not only visually alike, they're historically linked. If a motif appears in one cave at 36,000 years ago and in another at 16,000 years ago, that's a 20,000-year gap. Is that evidence of incredible cultural persistence? A rediscovery of the same simple idea, 2 unrelated uses of a basic shape? The answer depends almost entirely on how tight and trustworthy your dates are. Similarly, if we want to trace changes, say a simple dot becoming a standardized sequence of dots associated with certain animals, we need enough well-dated examples to see a pattern, not a mirage created by uneven sampling. If our earliest dated instance just happens to be the best preserved, we might think that's the origin, when really, it's only the earliest survivor. The uncomfortable truth is that right now, the temporal resolution of Paleolithic cave art is coarse. We can often say early versus late Upper Paleolithic, sometimes narrow it further, but we rarely know whether two marks of alley apart were made in the same century or even the same millennium. That doesn't make the search for structure hopeless. It just means we have to be honest about the fuzziness of the timeline. When we start talking about systems, scripts, and proto-writing, suturation, before we can claim these signs were being used like a code, we have to look very closely at where they sit in the caves themselves, what they're next to, what they touch, and how they're composed. That's where placement starts to matter as much as age. If time gives us one axis to work with, space gives us the other. The when is fuzzy, but the where inside the cave is often very sharp. And that turns out to matter a lot, because Ice Age people weren't doodling on a sketchpad. They were choosing specific walls, specific corners, specific depths underground, and putting very specific things there. If you're trying to figure out what a set of recurring marks is doing, that real estate is your first big clue. Start with the most basic divide, deep cave versus entrance zone. Some of the famous sites, think Lascaux, Chauvet, Neo, have art many hundreds of meters from daylight. To reach those chambers, you have to squeeze through narrow passages, climb, sometimes crawl in the dark. Even with modern lights and safety gear, it's a serious effort. Now, picture doing that with fat dripping stone lamps or smoking torches, trying not to fall into pits you can barely see. So, when you find our recurring 32 signs deep in the interior, on panels that would have required a full expedition to reach, that's already telling you something. These weren't casual marks. Somebody thought it was worth burning fuel, organizing a small party, and going into a dangerous, disorienting space to put them there. By contrast, other signs appear near cave mouths, or in wide, naturally lit galleries. You could see them from the entrance, or with only a little artificial light. Those spots are where everyday life clusters, hearths, napping floors, butchered bones. Art in that zone might have been visible to anyone coming and going, kids running in and out, elders sitting by the fire. So you have at least two different use contexts right away. A dot cluster 500 meters underground, on a panel you can only reach by crawling single file, is living a very different life than a dot cluster by the entrance, eye level next to a hearth. The shapes might be identical, but the cost to access them, and the likely audience, is totally different. Then there's what the marks are next to. The 32 signs very rarely appear in isolation on a blank wall. They almost always share space with animals. Mammoths, horses, bison, ibex, reindeer, lions, rhinos, you name it. And they're not randomly scattered around those animals. Sometimes a sign is hovering over the back, tucked between the legs, placed right at the flank, or repeated near the heads of multiple creatures in the same panel. A row of lines near a series of horses might mean nothing, but when similar rows of lines keep showing up next to horses in other caves, and not next to say, mammoths, you start to suspect a pattern. Maybe the sign is tagging the species, maybe it's referring to something about that animal's behavior, migration, mating, danger, luck. We don't know which, but the selective pairing hints that there's some kind of narrative or thematic relationship. This kind of mark belongs with this kind of animal. Sometimes different kinds of signs cluster on the same panel, as if the wall has been turned into a sort of information zone. You might see hand stencils framing the edges, dots and lines near the animals, and a lattice or ladder sign off to one side. That layout might not be random. It could be a kind of spatial grammar. Put this type of mark here, another type there, to structure the way people read the surface. Panel composition becomes crucial. Are the signs scattered, or are they forming sequences? Do you see 3 lines, then a gap, then 3 more lines, always in that order? Do certain signs repeat at fixed intervals across a panel like punctuation? Are they stacked vertically, running horizontally, spiraling around a central figure. Archaeologists have documented clusters that look suspiciously like ordered strings, dots progressing from one to many, sets of lines that seem to count up or down, barbed signs that appear at the end of animal sequences. You can't prove they're encoding numbers or calendar cycles just by looking, but you can say these aren't slapped on at random. Someone cared about their arrangement. And again, the cave pushes you to think about audience. An image in a narrow side passage that only a few people can physically fit into is almost by definition intimate. A little panel set shoulder height in a dead-end alcove is the perfect spot for a small ritual, a whispered story, or teaching a child something important 1-1. If your 32 symbol sign appears there, you can imagine it functioning as a prompt. Here's where we talk about this animal, this season, this myth. By contrast, a huge central chamber with resonant acoustics and art at multiple heights could host 50 people at once. Marks in that kind of amphitheater space might have been part of performances, storytelling, initiation ceremonies, group decisions. The same ladder sign painted large and high in a great hall is suddenly a public symbol, not a private note. Then there's the question of group identity. Some signs cluster regionally. A particular abstract shape might be common in one river valley and rare or absent in another, even when the animal art looks broadly similar. That has led some researchers to suggest that certain motifs functioned almost like logos or tribal marks broadcasting who you are, where you're from, or which network you belong to. Placement fits that idea too. A highly visible sign at an entrance or at a natural gateway deeper inside could be a kind of territorial tag. This is our cave, our ancestors' place. Smaller variants of the same sign, tucked into more hidden spots, might then carry additional layers of meaning accessible only to insiders. All of this depth, lighting, neighbors on the wall, composition, visibility, feeds into the bigger question of function. Were these marks tools for hunting magic, mnemonic hooks for stories and seasonal knowledge, emblems of clans and alliances, cues for teaching and initiation? Probably some combination varying across time and region. But here's the key thing. Location can be incredibly informative without ever proving language. You can stand in front of a panel and say with some confidence, this arrangement looks systematic. It's repeated elsewhere. Its position next to these animals in this kind of space suggests it meant something consistent to the people who used it. That's a long way from saying this is a sentence. This mark stands for the sound bar, and that one stands for raw writing, in the strict sense, is about mapping visible marks onto speech, encoding words, syllables or sounds, in a way that can be read by someone who wasn't there when the marks were made. Special regularities, thoughtful placement, and repeated pairings can show you a structured symbolic system. They can strongly hint that people were encoding information outside their own heads. What they can't do on their own is tell you whether that information was linguistic, tied to spoken language, or more like a set of conventional signs that triggered shared knowledge. When you see this next to a bison in this chamber, you're supposed to remember the story, the ritual, the taboo. To sort that out, we have to zoom out from walls and tunnels to the concept itself. Before we can argue that the 32 signs were a form of writing, we have to ask what actually counts as writing in the first place, and where do other human symbol systems fit on that spectrum. If you ask 10 experts to define writing, you'll get at least 12 answers, but they all tend to circle around a few key ideas, and those ideas matter a lot when we try to decide what to do with those 32 recurring Ice Age symbols. Start at the very bottom of the ladder, marks that don't mean anything. If you drag a stick through mud, or scrape a rock along a wall, you'll leave a trace. Most of the visual noise humans make even today is just that, incidental. No shared meaning, no intention beyond this is what happens when my hand moves. The moment a mark reliably stands for something in someone's mind, it stops being noise and becomes a symbol. A simple example, a handprint. Press your painted hand to the wall and lift it away. You get a crisp outline. Do that in a cave surrounded by your group. And over time, that handprint can come to stand for, I was here, or we, this group, claim this place, or this person has done the ritual. The mark isn't just a smudge anymore. It's a symbol, because people agree, consciously or not, that it means something. Now stack symbols together in a patterned way, and you get a sign system. Traffic signs are a modern version. A red octagon doesn't spell any word, but it's standardized enough that almost everyone understands. Stop, combine colors, shapes, placements, and you can run a whole road network on that system. It's not language in the strict sense. You can't use traffic signs to tell a joke or describe your childhood, but it's still a systematic way of encoding and decoding shared meanings. Beyond that, you get notation. Notation is where symbols begin to track things in an organized, often quantitative way. Think of tally marks scratched into bone. 1 notch per animal killed, 1 per day passed, 1 per shell traded. The notches don't directly stand for spoken words, but they correspond to counts, intervals, or categories that everyone in the group understands. The archaeological record is full of this kind of thing. You have 20,000-year-old bones with carefully grouped incisions that look like counting. You have Neolithic clay tokens, little cones, spheres, and discs in different quantities used in the Near East to keep track of sheep, jars of grain, or labor obligations. Later, some of those tokens get pressed into clay envelopes, then simplified into drawn marks, and eventually ununiform. That entire story is one long gradient from simple notation to full writing. So where do we draw the line? When does a sign system stop being just symbols and become writing? Most scholars would say that writing, properly speaking, does 3 big things. First, it has stable conventional meanings. If a mark means horse on Monday and rain on Friday, it's not very useful for a writing to work. A community has to settle on relatively fixed associations. This shape equals this word, this sound, this idea, and maintain that stability over time and space. A scribe hundreds of miles away has to hear roughly the same thing in their head when they see the mark as the person who first wrote it. Second, it has combinatorial structure. Individual signs aren't just floating around on their own. They're arranged according to rules, an order that matters. In alphabetic writing, you combine letters into words. In syllabic or logographic scripts, you string signs or characters together in meaningful sequences. Change the order, and you change the meaning. Dog bites man is not man bites dog. That ordered, rule-governed combination is a hallmark of full writing. Third, and most crucially, it can encode language, actual speech. A full writing system isn't just labeling things or counting them. It lets you represent spoken utterances, sentences, names, stories, prayers, laws. That doesn't mean every script is purely phonetic. Many, like early Sumerian or Egyptian, mix sound values with word values and semantic hints. But somewhere in the system, there's a pathway from mark to speech. See the sign? Recover at least part of what someone would have said out loud. That's what separates writing from, say, a map, a family crest, a star chart, or a modern subway diagram. All of those are sophisticated symbolic systems. None of them by themselves let you write down a conversation. This is why early notational systems sit in a gray zone. Those clay tokens in 6,000-year-old Mesopotamia were clearly meaningful. A cone stood for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a large measure, in a way that people in that economic network shared. Strung together, a handful of tokens could say, in effect, 3 small measures owed, or 5 animals delivered. That's powerful, but it's not yet writing. You can't record a myth with tokens. You can't spell a personal name. You're tracking quantities and categories, not transcribing grammar. Prototyping is the next step up that gradient. This is where you get complex sign repertoires, hundreds of distinct shapes in some cases, used in relatively fixed formats to record information, land holdings, offerings to temples, ritual inventories. But the system doesn't consistently represent the sound structure of spoken language. Scholars can often infer what's going on from context and later scripts, but you can't, for example, reconstruct full sentences. The Indus signs are a famous candidate. So are some early Chinese oracle bone markings and Neolithic European symbol sets. They're clearly more than decoration. They might even encode names and titles, but whether they cross the threshold into full writing is still debated. So where do the 32 Ice Age symbols land on this spectrum? On one hand, they tick several boxes. They're abstract and standardized enough that a ladder sign in one cave looks strikingly like a ladder sign in another cave hundreds of kilometers away that hints at conventional meanings shared across groups. They appear in repeated pairings and sequences, especially around animals, which suggests some kind of combinatorial use. This sign plus this animal equals this idea. If, as some researchers propose, certain sequences of lines or dots correlate with seasonal behaviors, rutting, calving, migration, then we might be looking at a notational system, marks that track time, phases, or events in a standardized way. That would be a huge cognitive leap. Information externalized on the wall, manageable at a glance, transmissible across generations. On the other hand, nothing we've found so far requires speech encoding. You can explain a lot with labels, tags, and counts. This many, this season, this kind of animal, this group's mark. You can run a surprisingly sophisticated hunting calendar or ritual schedule entirely on that level without ever needing a sign for if, because, or yesterday. A repertoire of just 32 recurring symbols actually fits that notational profile pretty well. It's big enough to cover a range of categories or phases, small enough to be memorized and standardized without the need for elaborate teaching systems. For comparison, full writing systems tend to explode in complexity. Early Sumerian uses hundreds of signs, Chinese scripts, thousands. Even syllables hover around 4,100 signs, and they clearly show phonetic behavior. With the Ice Age marks, we don't yet see unambiguous evidence of phonetic use. No obvious rebus games, where a sign is used for its sound value in another word. No long-ordered strings that look like they'd re-encoding sentences rather than cycles or counts. No bilingual Rosetta Stone panels, where a pictorial scene can be matched line for line with a symbolic sequence. So if we want to be fair to the data and to the people who made these marks, we need to set a clear test. What would actually persuade cautious scholars that these symbols are or are not a form of writing? Evidence in favor would look something like this. Consistent sequences that are too long and varied to be simple labels or counts. Patterns where a sign's position, relative to others, clearly changes meaning. Potential phonetic behavior, signs standing in for sounds in personal names or place names, and in a perfect world, some kind of correlation with later, better understood scripts in the same regions. Evidence against would be equally systematic. Demonstrations that all known sequences can be explained as calendars, toys, or categorical tags. Strong correlations between sign combinations and ecological cycles without any need to invoke speech, and a lack of any convincing phonetic behavior, even after exhaustive analysis. Right now, the 32 symbols sit in the middle of that spectrum. They're far beyond random doodles. They might represent one of the earliest known notational systems, a kind of Ice Age data layer laid over the animal world. But whether they cross the line into true writing, that's still an open question. To explore that possibility, we have to look at the leading hypothesis that's been making waves lately. The idea that these marks are tracking seasons and animal life cycles, a deep time calendar carved into stone. Imagine living in an Ice Age landscape, without clocks, without maps, without a written word. Your year isn't divided into March and September. It's divided into when the reindeer cross the valley, when the salmon run, when the bison bulls start fighting, when the daylight shrinks to a few bitter hours. Miss the timing by a couple of weeks. And you don't just lose convenience. You lose calories. You risk your children going hungry for an entire season. That's the world in which these 32 symbols show up. And this is where the calendar, or seasonal knowledge hypothesis comes in. The idea is simple but powerful. Those little clusters of lines, dots, reshapes, and ladder signs might not be random decoration at all. They might be records not of myths or royal decrees, but of time, of when animals do what they do. Think of it like this. You paint a magnificent bison on the cave wall that might mark the importance of bison to your group, commemorate a hunt, or play a role in some ritual. But alongside the bison, you add a run of short lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those lines might not mean 6 bison killed. They might mean the 6th lunar month, after the snow melts, is when this animal calves. Or the 6th notch, after a certain celestial event, is when the herds reach this valley. In other words, that animal plus that sequence of marks equals a bit of structured seasonal knowledge. Bison plus 6 equals this moment in the annual cycle. Once you start thinking that way, a lot of the Ice Age marks begin to look suspiciously like tallies. Dots and short strokes are the most obvious candidates. They're easy to standardize, easy to add one at a time. Put them in a row, and you get a count. That's basically a tally stick, but on stone. Now, imagine that instead of just counting how many, you're counting how long. You could track the number of lunar months from one key event to another, from the animal's mating season to its birthing season. The delay between a visible sign in the sky, say the first appearance of a certain star at dawn, and the arrival of a migratory herd, the length of safe travel on sea ice, or the ice-free period of a river. You don't need a word for May or October to do this. You just need repeatable units, lunar cycles, visible moons, regularly recurring phenomena, and a shared understanding in the group that 5 notches here always starts counting from the same reference point. Some researchers have gone further and suggested that specific symbols work as anchors in this system. Take the Y sign that shows up with certain pregnant-looking animals. One speculative reading is that the Y means something like giving birth or to bear. If that's right, then a bison image with a Y sign and a set of tally marks might be saying X months. After the mating season, this species gives birth. The calendar hypothesis in its more developed form suggests that Ice Age people were encoding a large chunk of their practical zoological knowledge this way, cave after cave, region after region. And you can see why that would be enormously useful. Hunter-gatherer life runs on seasonality. You need to know when the salmon are fat, when the birds are molting and easier to catch, when berries peak, when the sea ice is thick enough to support your weight, but thin enough to break up later for seal hunting. You don't have a smartphone weather app. You have memory, tradition, and whatever you can externalize in durable form. Caves, especially those with stable temperatures and long occupation histories, are perfect for this. They're refuges, gathering places, ritual centers, but also potentially archives. A wall full of animals and marks could function as a multi-generational knowledge board. This is what happens out there. And when it happens, according to the sky and the moon and the cycles we've watched for a lifetime. So, the strength of the seasonal knowledge hypothesis is not just that it's neat, but that it lines up with a deep, practical need. Any group that stays in roughly the same region for generations will accumulate fairly precise, local calendars in their heads. Externalizing that information, making it visible, stable, rememberable, would supercharge that knowledge. A youngster doesn't have to wait 15 years to personally observe every rare event. They can be taught, look, when you see this in the sky, count this many moons, then hunt this animal here. In other words, the marks become a cognitive tool, a way of compressing complex seasonal patterns into compact visual formulas. But there are problems. For one thing, counts are incredibly ambiguous. If you see 10 dots next to a horse, that might be 10 individuals in a herd, 10 kills made, 10 days of travel, 10 lunar cycles from some starting point, 10 years since a memorable event. Without a clear key, we're guessing. And the Ice Age caves don't come with user manuals. The ambiguity gets worse when you notice that similar numbers appear in different contexts. A run of 7 lines near one species and 7 lines near another doesn't necessarily mean those animals share the same calendar slot. It might just mean 7 is a very common number, because there are lots of things that come in. 7's days in a visible moon phase, clear layers in a migration route, members of a particular hunting party. On top of that, the placement of marks is not always where a tidy calendar theory would like it to be. Sometimes the dots and lines sit neatly beside an animal's torso, as if they'd carefully associated. Other times, they float between figures or appear in positions that make a strict This equals. Months since mating, reading much less convincing. In some caves, the same symbol appears alone, with no animal present at all. Is it still counting animal seasons there, or something else entirely? And then there's the multiplicity problem. A given animal doesn't just intersect with a single seasonal fact. It has many. Rut season, calving season, peak fatness, migration in, migration out, fur shedding, or molting. If you only see one sequence of lines by that animal, which of those things is it tracking? Without a stable cross-site rulebook, this symbol always counts from rut to birth. Or these ties always start from the first spring moon. The same pattern could be interpreted half a dozen ways. That's the main weakness of the hypothesis right now. It can fit a lot of data, but so can many other stories. A row of 5 dots could be months in a calendar. It could also be 5 hunters, 5 successful kills, or a ritual number with no direct timekeeping function at all. The risk is that we tune our brains to see calendar and then find supportive cases everywhere, even where they don't really belong. So, what would help? What kind of evidence would move this from an attractive story to a serious testable model? First, independent seasonal data. If you can show that, in site after site, a particular count associated with a given species consistently matches a known biological interval, say the gestation length of horses, or the timing between rut and migration. That's not trivial, especially if those counts vary sensibly between species. Horse symbols shouldn't have the same numbers as deer if their cycles differ in real life. Second, consistent mapping rules. You'd want to see that counts always begin from the same kind of reference point, maybe from the first visible crescent moon after winter solstice, or from the reappearance of a certain star. That's tricky to prove, but you can look for patterns relative to astronomical events we can reconstruct. If a specific sign reliably co-occurs with animal imagery and clusters in parts of caves that align with certain celestial directions or light effects, that strengthens the case. Third, cross-regional stability. Do the same symbols behave similarly, hundreds of kilometers apart? If the Y sign hypothetically always appears with animals in apparent late pregnancy poses, and is paired with similar tally patterns across France, Spain, and Italy, that's a much stronger argument for a shared semantic value than if it behaves randomly. Finally, you'd want to rule out simpler alternatives. If every occurrence of a dot sequence can be replaced by this many animals, or this many people, or this many times we performed the ritual, and those explanations fit the archaeological context, better then the heavy machinery of a full-blown calendar might not be necessary. Right now, the seasonal knowledge hypothesis sits in that tantalizing middle ground. It explains why small, repeatable marks cluster around useful animals. It fits what we know about hunter-gatherer reliance on fine-grained ecological timing. It turns caves into something like libraries of practical wisdom. But until we can systematically tie specific counts and symbols to independently known cycles, biological or astronomical, it remains one hypothesis among several. And that brings us to another angle on these marks, one that meshes with the calendar idea but doesn't depend on it. The possibility that what we're seeing is a kind of Ice Age data layer laid directly onto the animal world. Not just when to hunt, but what to know about each species. Think about what a data layer actually is. On a map today, you can toggle on roads or weather or restaurants. Same landscape, different overlays of information, depending on what you care about. Now, imagine that Ice Age caves are doing something similar. The painted bison, or horse, or mammoth, is the base layer. The thing itself, the animal, is seen and remembered. But next to it, or over it, or tucked into its outline, is this compact cluster of extra signs, lines, dots, chevrons, E's, crosses. Those little marks might be the data layer. Here is the animal, and here is what you need to know about it. If that's even roughly right, then the real question becomes, what kind of information would be worth encoding? The most obvious candidate is quantity. You go on a spectacular hunt. You bring down a huge bison. You paint it to mark the event. Adding 5 lines is an easy way to say, there were 5 of us, or we killed 5 animals, or this was our 5th big winter hunt. Ethnographic records from recent hunter-gatherers are full of this kind of thing. People carve or paint stick figures, animals, and then a simple count. How many hunters? How many kills? How many days of travel? No full writing system, just local conventions. These notches equals this many. But the possibilities don't stop at counting. Those marks could be about social identity, who you are in relation to the animal. A particular clan might consider itself people of the horse, or children of the salmon. They might have an emblem, a certain zigzag, a special form of cross, a way of arranging dots that they attach to their animal in the cave, not because they invented horses, but because in their stories, their group's fate is tied to that species. You can see something like this in recent societies without formal writing. A hunting band might have a distinctive spear mark, a specific burn pattern, a little emblem scratched into wood or bone. It doesn't spell the name of the group, but everyone locally understands that sign equals those people. The same logic could extend into taboo and permission. In many foraging cultures, some animals are off limits at certain times, sacred during breeding season, forbidden to women or uninitiated men, restricted to particular rituals. A simple added symbol, a cross, a bar, a slash might work as don't touch, or only at this time, or only for this group. Now imagine that repeated across generations. You grow up learning when you see the bison with this extra sign, it means we don't hunt them. When you see it with this other sign, it means we can. You don't need formal grammar for that. You just need stable conventions. And that's where the combinatorial hints get interesting. When researchers look closely, they don't just see random scatter. Certain signs like to hang out together. A particular line pattern shows up repeatedly with horses and almost never with mammoths. A lattice sign turns up with ibex, but rarely with aurochs. A Y-form clusters around animals, shown with swollen bellies or clear reproductive poses. On their own, those patterns don't prove semantic content, but they suggest something more than idle doodling. If you consistently pair sign A with animal X and sign B with animal Y, and you never swap them, you've got at least a basic code. You're saying X plus A is one chunk of meaning, Y plus B is another. You can push the idea further. Maybe you add one sign to indicate calving season, another to indicate rut, another to indicate prime hunting time, another to indicate dangerous. Respect this one. A horse with a certain mark and 6 lines might signal, don't hunt during these months. The same horse with a different mark and 4 lines might signal this is when you hunt. Again, we're deep in speculation territory here, but the structure, animal plus modifier, is exactly how a basic data layer would look. There's also a more social reading that doesn't even require ecological coding. What if some of these marks are essentially signatures, not the way we sign our names, but tokens of participation? Our group was part of this hunt. Our lineage tells this story. These events belong to us. In some modern societies, rock paintings of animals become focal points for repeated gatherings. Different families add their own emblem over time. A spiral here, a line there, turning the wall into a playlist of shared history. The animal is the event. The marks are the people who claim a relationship to it. If something similar was happening in Ice Age Europe, then the repeated pairing of certain symbols with animals could be telling you the same community came back here again and again. These marks are them asserting continuity and ownership of the story. And that matters even if you can't read a single sign, because once you have conventions about which marks go where, you're in the domain of structured information. You're not just making images. You're encoding relationships between people and animals, between seasons and species, between groups and places. It starts to feel less like random graffiti and more like a thin, flexible layer of data spread over the animal world. But here's where the brakes need to go on. We are exceptionally good at seeing pattern and meaning, especially when we want there to be one. Show a modern analyst a dataset with repeated pairings, and they will map it into charts, flows, inferred rules. Do the same with cave signs and suddenly, you're halfway to announcing the first written language. That's dangerous. A symbol that reliably appears with horses might be about horses' gestation cycles. Or it might be the emblem of a horse-hunting clan. Or it might be a generic great hunt marker used for multiple species that just happen to be preserved mostly with horses. Repeated pairings and combinatorial structure are necessary for a real information system, but they're not sufficient for decipherment. A data layer can exist without us being able to read it. Correlation is not translation to move beyond wow that looks patterned. We'd need to show that specific combinations of animal plus sign behave in consistent, rule-like ways that can't easily be explained by simpler stories. Clan mark, tally of kills, random preference. Until then, the safest statement is the modest one. These marks placed where they are, and repeated how they are, strongly suggest that Ice Age people were systematically attaching information to animals. Whether that information was when, how many, who, not now, or this story is ours, is still an open question, which opens up another deeper possibility. If these symbols really were a data layer, even a simple one, then caves weren't just galleries or shrines. They were interfaces, places where humans could interact with a compressed external memory of the animal world. And once your species learns to do that, to pull meaning out of abstract marks in a stable place, the jump from data layer to sacred technology is not as big as it sounds. For a lot of researchers, that's exactly where the story pivots. Once you start thinking of caves as interfaces, it's hard not to notice that these interfaces are buried deep underground, in places that are hard, dangerous, and sometimes terrifying to reach. That's the starting point for the ritual interpretation. In many traditional societies, caves aren't just holes in the ground, they're thresholds, liminal spaces, the place where the normal world gives way to the underworld, or the spirit world, or the realm of ancestors. You live your life up here, under the sky, with sunlight and seasons and predictable rhythms. Then a small group leaves the camp carrying torches and disappears into a dark opening in the pasta. Rock. The temperature drops. Sound changes. The walls close in. Your sense of direction slips. Firelight throws moving shadows that make the rock seem alive. You keep going. In some Ice Age caves, that going meant crawling through tight tunnels, wading through freezing water, edging along ledges with a drop into darkness beside you. You're already outside ordinary experience before you paint a single line. Ritual specialists call them shamans, priests, trance, walkers, whatever word you prefer, often use exactly this kind of environment shift to induce altered states of consciousness. The point is to break the everyday frame, to detach from normal time and normal perception so that visions or spirit encounters feel real and convincing. Now, put the symbols back into this. If a cave is a threshold to the other world, then the art inside it isn't just decoration. It's part of the machinery that makes the threshold work. The animals, the handprints, the 32 recurring signs, these become tools in a ceremony, not illustrations in a book. Some researchers have pushed this further by connecting cave art to a very specific kind of inner experience, synoptic phenomena. Entic just means generated within the visual system itself, not images of deer or trees out there in the world, but patterns created by your own nervous system. You've probably seen some of them yourself. Press gently on your closed eyes, and you may see grids, zigzags, flashes, radiating lines. In migraines or fevers or certain drug states, people report lattices, spirals, dots, nested curves, flickering chevrons. Neuroiseologists have mapped a lot of these forms. They aren't random. The structure of the visual cortex tends to produce a limited set of basic patterns when it misfires or runs outside its normal operating range. Now, go back to the 32 signs. Abstract forms like zigzags, lattices, dots in clusters, branching lines, radiating shapes. They show up again and again in Paleolithic caves. They also show up on rock art from later periods, on ritual objects, in visionary art from shamans in the Amazon, Siberia, Southern Africa, Australia. You don't have to claim a direct line of tradition to notice the overlap. If altered states routinely produce certain geometric experiences, and if some people in Ice Age groups were deliberately seeking those states for ritual purposes, then it's not crazy to imagine that at least some of the recurring signs are externalized versions of internal, visions. On this reading, the cave becomes something like a shared dream space. A shaman has a trance vision in the depths of the cave, zigzags of light, spinning grids, floating dots around a great bison or horse that feels alive and powerful. Afterward, they and their companions fix parts of that vision onto the wall. The next time a ceremony happens, the paintings don't just depict animals, they help participants enter the same vision again. The marks are like handles on the experience. This is where the strengths of the ritual interpretation really bite. The physical effort and danger of accessing some decorated chambers fits a world where not everyone is supposed to go there. It matches small, controlled ritual groups rather than casual crowd traffic. The placement of art deep inside, far beyond where you'd need to go for simple shelter or storage, makes sense if the journey itself is part of the ceremony. A descent into the earth, into darkness, into the belly of something sacred, and the repetition of certain geometric forms across thousands of years, in contexts that otherwise vary a lot, looks very much like the survival of a ritual vocabulary. A stable set of tools for managing extraordinary experiences. But here's the catch. Ritual symbols can be powerful, stable and widely recognized, without being writing in any strict sense. Think about the Christian cross, the Islamic crescent, the Buddhist wheel, the yantra, the mandala, the medicine wheel. These are charged images. They cue stories, doctrines, emotions, and practices. They can be combined, modified, stylized. They structure sacred spaces, but they don't on their own encode sentences the way a written language does. They're more like portals than propositions. The same could be true for Paleolithic signs. A ladder-like motif might signal this is a place of passage, or here you contact a certain class of beings, or this is the route a soul takes after death. A series of dots might be the crowd of spirits, or the many eyes of an ancestor. A Y-shape might be branching paths, or a female principle, or a place where choices are made. All deeply meaningful, all embedded in story and practice. None necessarily functioning as phonetic signs or grammatical markers. If we're not careful, it's easy to slide from "this was sacred" straight into "this was a script," because modern people tend to imagine that importance demands text. But a ritual system doesn't have to be linguistic to be sophisticated. So, how do we keep this grounded, instead of drifting into romantic fiction? One way is to be brutally honest about what the evidence can and can't support. We can point to the extreme depth and difficulty of access in some caves and say that it's consistent with controlled, possibly ritual use. We can point to soot deposits, broken stalagmites, modified acoustics, and say people were doing more than just painting. They were transforming these spaces maybe for ceremony. We can look at the overlap between inoptic patterns and common geometric signs and say there's a plausible neurobiological basis for some of these forms in altered states. What we can't do is reconstruct the full cosmology of Ice Age Europe from a handful of repeating signs and our favorite shamanism textbook. We don't know what substances, if any, they used. We don't know their myths. We don't know who went into the caves or how often. We don't know whether the same sign meant the same thing everywhere, or whether local groups customized the shared vocabulary. Most importantly for our question, we don't know where ritual symbolism shades into information storage. A lattice that started as the grid I saw in a trance might over generations become the mark we use for this spirit, this season, this rule. A visionary symbol can harden into a conventional one. At some point, the boundary between sacred image and functional sign gets fuzzy. It's entirely possible that the 32 recurring symbols live in that fuzzy zone. Not full writing, not random doodles, sacred technology, a compact toolkit for triggering and stabilizing altered states, anchoring visions to specific animals and places, and maybe, just maybe, smuggling practical knowledge inside a framework of ritual. To figure out how far that went, we have to look at another capacity. Our ancestors were clearly developing by this time the ability to use patterns and stories as memory devices, teaching tools, and shared reference points that outlive any single ceremony. Imagine you're a child in one of these Ice Age groups. You don't have books. You don't have maps. You don't have YouTube tutorials to replay when you forget how to make a spear point, or where the herds go in late autumn. What you have is people, elders, hunters, midwives, ritual specialists, and what they have is memory. In small-scale oral societies, memory isn't a nice-to-have, it's infrastructure. If crucial knowledge dies with a few individuals, your whole group can pay the price the next hard winter. So, humans get very good at something most of us barely think about anymore, externalizing memory without writing. We build memory palaces out of landscapes. This ridge means turn left to find the springs. That oddly shaped boulder is where the story of the great drought always gets told. This bend in the river is where the tricks to animal fooled the ancestors and taught them a rule. We bind rules and facts into songs and stories because rhythm and narrative make them sticky. We attach information to bodies, scars, tattoos, hairstyles, ritual markings that tell you at a glance who's initiated, who's from where, who knows what. Now, put the 32 signs back into this world. Once you stop imagining them as little fossilized letters in some lost alphabet, another possibility opens up. Maybe they're not trying to encode speech at all. Maybe they're trying to cue speech. In other words, mnemonics. A mnemonic system doesn't need to spell out every word of a story. It just needs to jog the memory of someone who already knows the story, the song, the route, the rule. Think about the way a musician uses a set list. On a scrap of paper, you might see intro river, wolves home, lully, fire. To anyone else, that's a weird poem. To the band, it's an entire concert. Each one-word prompt unlocks hundreds of memorized lyrics and musical moves. Or think about how many religious traditions use images as anchors, a sequence of painted panels in a church, a set of icons around an altar, a string of beads with different shapes or colors. To an outsider, they're decorations. To insiders, each one is a stop on a mental journey. This picture is the Annunciation. That one is the Crucifixion. This bead is for this prayer. That bead is for that one. The signs in the caves could have worked like that. A row of dots followed by a ladder shape and a Y might not say anything in the way a sentence does. But to people who've heard the relevant song 100 times around the fire, that sequence might shout, "This is where you tell the story of the winter crossing, the split in the path, the choice the ancestors made." Crucially, mnemonics can be structured, standardized, and widely shared without ever becoming phonetic. You can agree as a culture that this shape goes with this class of ideas. A spiral might always cue a particular myth cycle, the origin of a clan, the path of game animals through the year, the journey of souls after death. A set of short parallel lines might always cue a list of taboo rules, who you can marry, who you can't, what you must never do in this kind of cave, or near this kind of animal. Stack enough of these together, and you don't get a text in our sense. You get something closer to a musical notation for oral performance, a scaffold, a path. That's why a limited repertoire might actually be an advantage. If there are only 32 symbols, everyone can learn them. You don't need years of specialized training, like a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia. A child could be taught slowly that this one is about many, this one is about splitting, this one is about enclosure, this one is about movement, and so on. Limiting the toolkit also enforces reuse. If you've got to map a huge range of stories, rules, and routes onto just a few dozen shapes, you're forced to develop conventions, shared habits, and once those conventions exist, they're easier to transmit across generations and across groups. You might not know exactly what another band, double line plus dots plus claviform combo means in detail, but you could have a rough idea of what domain it lives in. That's about the bison migrations, or that's about the underworld water spirits, or that's the big taboo story about what happens if you break such and such rule. What would we expect to see in the archaeological record if something like this were going on? First, repeated sequences. If a particular run of marks shows up again and again, in different caves, in more or less the same order, that's a signal, not proof of writing, but a hint that people weren't just doodling. They were following a template. Second, consistent ordering. If, Whenever certain signs appear together, sign A almost always comes before sign B. That suggests a conventional structure. It might mean, this is the way the story always begins, or this is the order you recite these names, or this is the way you always describe this journey. Third, learning contexts. If we found clusters of marks in places that look like they were used for instruction, near cave entrances where light is better, in spots with lots of finger tracing and overpainting, perhaps associated with child footprints or shorter handprints, that would strengthen the mnemonic interpretation. Some of that is exactly what researchers are now starting to explore. A few of the 32 signs do seem to appear in favored combinations. Certain sequences cluster around particular animals as if they were standardized packages of information attached to that species. Some marks are more common in accessible areas of caves, others deeper in, as if people were learning the system step by step. But even if these patterns firm up, we're probably still not looking at writing in the strict sense. Writing, as linguists define it, is a way of representing the words of a language in a stable, recoverable form. You can, in principle, reconstruct the spoken utterance from the marks alone, even if you've never heard it. A mnemonic system is different. It assumes the spoken content already exists in living memory. The marks don't replace that content. They support it. They're like pegs in a cloakroom. The coats, the stories, the teachings, the detailed knowledge are hung on them, taken down, rearranged, but never fully contained in the pegs themselves. If the last person who knows the story dies, the pegs become mysterious. You can see that they're regular, that people clearly cared about them, that they obeyed some hidden logic, but you can't read them because there's nothing left to unlock. That might be exactly where we are with the Ice Age signs. They look structured, they look deliberate, they look like a compact system for organizing and retrieving information that mattered. But unless those marks start revealing a tight language-like relation to speech, things like clear syntax, positional rules that behave like grammar, or strong correlations with known linguistic units, we're probably safer thinking of them as a kind of external memory technology, not a lost alphabet. And that raises an uncomfortable question. When we sift through statistics and pattern-finding software, how do we tell the difference between a genuine mnemonic structure and the human tendency to see patterns, even where none were intended? One answer is, maybe we don't, because there's another layer these marks could be operating on that overlaps with memory, but isn't quite the same thing. Identity. If you drop into most small-scale societies that anthropologists have documented in the last couple of centuries, one thing jumps out right away. People carry their group memberships on their skin, on their tools, on the things they build. Scarification patterns that tell you which lineage someone belongs to. Tattoo motifs that say, I'm from this island, this village, this clan. Shield designs, house posts, beadwork, feather arrangements, all coded to say, in effect, this is who we are, and this is where our people have rights. Ice Age groups didn't have metal badges, passports, or ID cards, but they absolutely had groups, families, bands, clans, seasonal alliances, and those groups had to coordinate. They needed ways to signal who was allowed to use which hunting grounds, who was in on which rituals, who could marry whom, who owed favors to whom. In that kind of world, a compact set of marks that everyone recognizes is incredibly useful, even if it never once tries to capture spoken language. Think of three big functions right away. First, clan signs. You and your relatives might adopt a particular combination of marks as ours. Whenever your group visits a cave, you add that combo near an animal you identify with, or at the entrance of a favored chamber. Over time, that sequence becomes an abstract emblem of your people. It doesn't need to say the clan's name phonetically. It just needs to be reliably associated with that social unit. Second, territorial signals. If a valley, a river crossing, or a particular cave niche is regularly used by one band in winter and another in summer, those places become contested zones of etiquette and expectation. Clear markers can reduce conflict. A certain symbol might mean, this is a place we have used for generations. Approach respectfully, trade if you want access. Another might say, This chamber is reserved for our initiation rites. Outsiders keep out. Third, initiation marks. Cross-cultural data show a strong pattern. Big life transitions often leave permanent signs. A first hunt, a coming-of-age rite, the completion of a dangerous journey. These moments get marked, sometimes literally with scars or tattoos, sometimes with repeated motifs woven into clothing or painted on the body. Imagine that some of the 32 Ice Age signs operate at that level. You endure a terrifying winter vigil, deep in a cave, guided by elders. At the climax of the ritual, you're allowed to paint a certain mark next to a specific animal. That mark now follows you for life. You might carry it on ornaments, on temporary body paint, on the handle of your spear. When you visit other groups, they can see at a glance how you're ranked, what you've endured, what you're authorized to know. Once you start thinking in those terms, the puzzle of standardized marks, spread over huge distances, looks a little different. You don't need a centralized academy of scribes to keep the forms consistent. You just need networks. Remember, these weren't isolated caves randomly sprinkled across a blank map. The Ice Age world was crisscrossed by kinship ties, marriage exchanges, seasonal gatherings, and long-distance trade in things like shells, pigments, stone, and stories. Whenever groups meet to swap mates, obsidian blades, or news about the herds, they're also swapping style. Young people watch how others paint themselves. They notice which combinations of marks get respect, which ones are reserved, which ones are joked about. Elders negotiate the meaning of symbols just as surely as they negotiate bride wealth. Over hundreds or thousands of years, this cultural traffic can keep a shared repertoire of forms remarkably stable. Even as individual bands drift apart genetically, and drift they will. Even in societies with strong conventions, stylistic details creep. Maybe one region favors thinner lines, another adds a little extra notch on one side of a symbol. A third tends to stretch a shape vertically instead of horizontally. To archaeologists, those tiny differences are gold. Because if symbols are acting partly as group signatures, you'd expect exactly that pattern. A stable core design, recognizably the same sign from Spain to Turkey, but with local dialects in how it's drawn. You can think of it almost like accents in spoken language. Everyone says the same basic sign, the same horseshoe, ladder, or V shape, but in one valley, it's almost closed. In another, it's sharply angular. In another, it leans. If you could see enough examples, you might start to see geographic clusters. This version belongs to the southwest, that one to the upper Danube. Time complicates this even further. Styles don't just vary in space. They evolve through time. If you track a particular symbol layer by layer through sediment, you might see it gradually change shape or drift in where it tends to be placed in caves, or shift in what it's associated with. Suddenly, it starts appearing next to a new animal, or in deeper chambers than before. Those changes can tell a story about contact and separation. If two regions show the same new twist on a symbol around the same date, that suggests recent interaction. Maybe people from one group migrated into the other's territory. Maybe a ritual specialist who used that variant traveled widely and became influential. If, on the other hand, an area keeps using a very old form of a sign long after neighboring regions have moved on, that hints at isolation. The style is conservative because there's less cultural traffic updating it. This is how archaeologists actually test identity hypothesis. They don't just point at marks and say, these feel like clan symbols. They count. You can catalog every occurrence of a sign across hundreds of sites. Note its exact shape, size, range, placement, and what other signs or animals it clusters with. Then you slice that data by region and by time period. If symbols were mostly free-form doodles, you'd expect a messy, noisy pattern. Every cave is different. No consistent geography, no clear temporal sequences. If they're functioning as part of an identity and network system, you'd expect more structure. Certain symbols would peak in specific regions. Some combinations would be strongly favored in certain river basins or mountain corridors. New variants would arise in one zone and then slowly radiate out along plausible travel routes. You could even look for border effects. Caves near the edges of different cultural regions might show mixed dialects of the symbols, just as people in linguistic borderlands often code switch. All of this can end up looking uncannily script-like. You have a fixed inventory of repeatable signs. They're standardized enough that you can classify them. They're combined in patterned ways. Their distribution across space and time reveals clear structure. The whole system is learned, transmitted, and tightly bound to social rules. That it's crucial to see what's missing. In a true writing system, the primary job of the symbols is to represent language, to stand in for words, syllables, or sounds. So, someone who doesn't already know the content could, in theory, reconstruct it. In an identity marking system, the primary job of the symbols is to represent relationships, who we are, where we belong, what rights we claim, which rituals and stories we are authorized to carry. Those marks might incidentally cue particular phrases or chants. This is our clan name, recite it now. But their meaning isn't a string of phonetic units. It's a social address. That's why identity systems can converge on many of the outward features of writing without crossing the line into language representation. They need consistency so that people can recognize who's who. They need conventions so that certain configurations are reserved for specific groups or roles. They need teaching because kids have to learn what's allowed and what's off limits. They also need flexibility. Groups split, merge, win prestige, lose wars, adopt allies' marks, forbid old ones after a disaster. The sign system has to be able to track all that without collapsing. The Ice Age sign repertoire could easily have carried this double load. Part mnemonic scaffold, part social signature. A single ladder shape might flag. This is the bison story sequence to insiders, and at the same time, quietly announce, through style and placement, this version belongs to our people, not the folks over the next mountain. From 21st century eyes, with half the information erased and none of the living context, those marks can look startlingly like the early stages of a writing system. But there's another danger hiding in that resemblance. If our statistical tools start finding neat regional patterns and temporal trends, how do we make sure we're not mistaking the fingerprints of identity and network structure for the footprints of actual language? To even ask that question, we have to talk about how you turn a few thousand ancient doodles into something you can run numbers on. Because nobody is just eyeballing photos and going, vibe check looks like grammar. They build datasets. You start by deciding what counts as a sign. Not every line on a cave wall makes the cut. A scratch left by an animal, a random drip of mineral deposit, a smear of pigment from somebody's hand. Those get filtered out as noise, at least in theory. What's left are shapes that repeat often enough, in clean enough form that you can say, this horseshoe here and that horseshoe there are instances of the same thing. Then you count. How many times does each sign show up? In how many caves? Over what time ranges? Which signs tend to appear alone, and which almost always come in company? From there, you start looking at relationships. Co-occurrence. Which symbols show up together on the same panel more often than random chance would predict? Sequencing. When multiple signs are drawn together, are they usually in the same order? Does ... line routinely appear as ... line, or do you sometimes get line ... line ... line clustering? If you ignore individual caves and map everything, do you see tight groups of signs that are almost always associated versus others that behave more independently? On paper, if you find a small fixed alphabet of symbols with a stable set of combinations, recurring orders, and clear clusters, that starts to look tantalizingly like a structured system. And that's where the danger begins, because all of those patterns depend on the quality of your data. And Ice Age archaeology is by definition a small and wildly uneven dataset. Some caves are spectacularly well documented, multiple expeditions, high-resolution scans, careful tracing of every mark under different light sources. Others, a few grainy black and white photos from the 1950s, taken in a hurry, with half the wall, hidden under calcite or modern graffiti. In some regions, Whole cave systems are still undiscovered, or inaccessible, or too fragile to enter. In others, early visitors literally scrubbed away insignificant marks to get a better view of the animals. When you put all that together, your grand statistical model of Ice Age symbol grammar might be built on a biased sample. Maybe the caves that are easiest to study just happen to be ones where a certain symbol combination was fashionable for a few hundred years. Maybe an entire regional variant of the repertoire is underrepresented because those sites are underwater now, or buried, or politically off-limits. That's not a small problem. That's the core challenge of trying to do big-picture pattern analysis on deep time. And it's not just about missing data, it's about how we classify the data we do have. Imagine you and I are coding the same panel from two different photos. There's a mark that looks kind of like a ladder, but the rungs are uneven and the sides are slightly curved. Is that still a ladder, or is it a different sign? Maybe a comb, or a fringe, or a multiple line motif. Now, flip to another cave. You see a U shape, with one side slightly longer than the other. I call it a horseshoe. You decide it's an open circle. Someone else catalogs it as a cut mark with tail. Those tiny disagreements cascade, because the only reason we can say there are 32 recurring signs is that someone, somewhere, drew the boundaries around what counts as the same. If your criteria are strict, only near-perfect matches count. Your symbol inventory might explode into 60 or 80 types, each with low counts, harder to see pattern. If your criteria are loose, anything vaguely ladderish goes in the ladder bin. You can force a messy reality into a neat set of 32. But you've also baked your own expectations into the data. That's confirmation bias in action. You go in wanting to find a compact signary, like an alphabet or syllary. You define categories that produce a compact signary. Then you're delighted to discover a compact signary. The loop closes so neatly you barely notice it. Circular classification isn't always malicious. A lot of the time it's just people doing their best with ambiguous, degraded material. But if we're going to claim there might be syntax rules about order and combination, we have to be especially paranoid about how those rules are being manufactured, which is why replicability matters so much here. In other sciences, if you claim to have found a new particle or a drug effect, other labs can try to repeat your experiment. With Ice Age symbols, the experiment is partly in your head. How you draw lines around a fuzzy mark and decide what it is. The only way to test that is radical transparency. Open datasets where anyone can see the raw images, the tracing decisions, the coding scheme, clear documentation of why a given mark was put into ladder instead of comb, or marked as uncertain instead of forced into a category. Then independent teams can recode the same panels using their own criteria, run their own co-occurrence and sequencing analyses, and see whether the patterns still show up. If the syntax vanishes as soon as you tweak the bins, if your beautiful recurring orders only exist under one person's classification scheme, that's a warning sign. If, on the other hand, different people using slightly different but reasonable rules keep finding the same structural regularities, that's far more compelling. So, what would strong evidence for a protoating-like system actually look like? First, consistency across distance. If a particular sequence of signs, say ladder Dowie, shows up in Spain, and then tens of thousands of years later, cousins of the same sequence show up in France, Italy, and Turkey, always in that order. That's interesting, especially if the individual signs also appear in other orders sometimes, but this specific combination is stubbornly fixed. Second, consistency across context. If ladder Y appears only next to pregnant horses, or only at cave entrances, or only in deep chambers, associated with a certain kind of ritual, scraping on the floor, that suggests it's a particular idea or phrase, not just decorative riffing. Third, positional rules. Maybe certain signs virtually never open a sequence, others almost never close it. Some only occur sandwiched between two specific classes of symbols. That starts to look a lot like syntax. Not just which units can appear together, but where in the chain they're allowed. Fourth, cross-site invariance. If you strip away local style differences, fat ladders versus skinny ladders, 3 rungs versus 4, and still find that statistically the abstract pattern ABC behaves the same way in widely separated regions that hints at a shared underlying rule system, rather than independent invention. And finally, resistance to noise. A real syntactic pattern should hold up when you add more data. As new caves are discovered and documented, the core rules emerge more clearly, not less. You don't keep having to invent exceptions or carve out special cases to protect your favorite hypothesis. Right now, we're nowhere near that standard. We have suggestive co-occurrences. We have hints of preferred orders in small samples. We have some intriguing clustering by region and time. Enough to justify curiosity. Absolutely not enough to declare, here lies the first human writing. And that's the tightrope. Our pattern-seeking brains love to turn coincidence into code. Give us 32 recurring marks spread over 30,000 years and half a continent, and we will invent grammar if you leave us alone with the spreadsheets long enough. The trick is to use statistics as a brake on imagination, not just as jet fuel. To keep asking with every pattern we find, is this really structure in the Ice Age world, or is it scaffolding in our own heads? Because until we can tell those apart with some confidence, any claim about these symbols being language, even a tiny embryonic half-formed kind of language, has to stay in the realm of possibility, not conclusion. So let's push that possibility to its logical limit. If these marks were the first writing, not just social signatures or ritual cues, but genuine attempts to pin spoken words to durable signs, what would it take to actually decipher them? To understand what that would take, we have to look at how every other ancient mystery script has been cracked. Because nobody ever deciphered an unknown system just by staring at it really hard and waiting for meaning to pop out. You need anchors. When Champollion cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs, he had the Rosetta Stone, the same text written 3 ways, hieroglyphic, deotic, and Greek. He already knew Greek, that gave him names, sentence boundaries, repetitions he could trace across scripts. When Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B, he didn't just intuit it was Greek from the vibes. He had hundreds of clay tablets, full strings of repeating groups, and a good idea that they were administrative records. He could look for place names for patterns like X of Y, X from Y, and test phonetic values until the whole system started to lock. Even Mayan glyphs, long thought to be purely symbolic, yielded when researchers found name tags on portraits, the same royal titles turning up next to the same kinds of faces and on the same kinds of monuments, and could cross-check them with later, colonially recorded Maya languages. In every case, there were 3 things: lots of text, some kind of bilingual, or at least a known reference point, and a strong sense of what the texts were about. With the Ice Age signs, we have none of that. No bilingual stone where a Magdalenian hunter kindly engraved, "This says, Oros calving in late spring." No preserved oral tradition you can line up against cave walls and go, oh, the 7 dots must be the 7 sisters, the Pleiades. No long inscriptions that might even in principle encode complex sentences. And that's before we even ask whether these marks are the right kind of thing to decipher. If we're going to call something language-like, even in a very early primitive sense, there are some minimum expectations. First, stable semantics. A given sign, or a given combination of signs, should mean roughly the same thing, wherever it appears. It doesn't have to be one-to-one. Modern words have multiple senses too. But ladder plus dot can't be bison pregnancy in one cave, danger bad air in another, and this way to the good mushrooms in a third with no pattern. Second, productive combinations. The system should let you build new messages out of a finite set of pieces. You don't just memorize 32 frozen logos like brand icons. You can combine them in ways that weren't directly copied from somewhere else. That's the difference between recognizing the McDonald's, arches, and actually writing a sentence. Third, context consistency. If the same sequence of signs shows up on wildly different kinds of panels next to horses here, mammoths there, abstract grids someplace else, it either has a very abstract meaning like sacred, or you're not dealing with language in any familiar sense. Real writing systems show clear biases. Some things go on graves, some in tax records, some on boundary stones. So if we wanted to test a language hypothesis, we'd be looking for exactly that kind of stability. Does a particular trio of marks always prefer the same neighborhood, same animal sex, same seasonally relevant body state, same part of the cave? Does it slot into sequences in ways that look rule-code rather than random? Even if all that checked out, we'd still hit the next wall. What kind of writing are we talking about? The 32 symbols repertoire is tiny compared to most mature scripts. Alphabetic systems tend to have a couple dozen signs, but those stand for sounds. Combine letters and you can write any word you can say. Logographic systems, where each mark stands for a word or concept, like classical Chinese, characters explode into hundreds or thousands of symbols. 32 recurring signs is much more compatible with something like a fixed inventory of categories, phases of the moon, parts of a hunt, types of places, animal life cycle stages, directions, clans. In that scenario, the marks aren't spelling out sentences the way you're hearing this one now. They're tagging reality with a limited library of labels. Think of it like icons on a phone screen. You can express a surprising amount with just a handful of pictures. Map, pin, heart, warning, triangle, checkmark. But you can't write Hamlet in emoji without doing absurd amounts of interpretive work. It's entirely possible that Ice Age people were using these symbols that way as a robust, meaningful code, but not a code that mirrors spoken language sound by sound. And if that's true, decipherment might not look like assigning consonants and vowels. It might look like reconstruction of a semantic codebook. You'd be trying to answer questions like, does this symbol track time? Does that cluster always correlate with reproductive status in animals? Is this mark essentially saying, here, now, soon, south, many, dangerous, owned by us? You'd never be able to translate a panel, as on the second new moon, after the snow melts, the salmon return here. But you could end up with something like spring soon, fish many place. That's still writing in a broad anthropological sense. Durable, conventional marks that carry specific information across space and time, but it's not phonetic writing. It's a log of categories. And that brings us back to why decipherment is so hard with what we have now. Most known scripts were cracked because of redundancy. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of inscriptions, often saying boring, repetitive things. So-and-so, son of so-and-so, offers 3 measures of barley to the god of wherever. Grain deliveries, tax lists, calendars, king lists. Boring is gold for code arrears. Ice Age caves, in contrast, give us small snippets. A handful of signs here, a short string there, spread over 30,000 years, and half a continent with huge gaps where sites either never existed, were never decorated, or simply haven't survived. We don't yet have the kind of dense, repetitive corpus that lets you say, oh, this 4-sign cluster appears 80 times, always in the same position relative to this animal, so it's probably a stock phrase or fixed label, and we certainly don't have that bilingual anchor. No surviving hunter-gatherers left us a glossary of the ancestors' cave marks in a language we can still speak. But that doesn't mean we're stuck forever. The history of decipherment is full of moments when a single new find flipped the table. The Rosetta Stone was just one stela lying in a fort wall. The key Maya breakthroughs depended on a handful of monuments with particularly clear name patterns. Linear Elamite, another ancient script, only started to yield in the 2020s when new inscriptions were documented in high detail and compared systematically. For the Ice Age signs, the next Rosetta Stone probably won't be an actual bilingual chunk of limestone. It might be something more subtle, like a newly found cave where long repeated sequences of signs accompany a seasonal migration route. A cluster of sites in one valley, all decorated within a few centuries of each other, where the same symbol strings recur in strongly patterned ways, or a massive improvement in data quality. High-resolution, multispectral recordings of known caves, revealing faint, previously invisible marks that turn our 32 signs into 40 or 20, or show new sequence patterns we simply couldn't see before. Better dating could help too. Right now, a lot of these marks have very fuzzy age estimates. If you can pin them down more tightly, not just sometime between 35,000 and 20,000 years ago, but this sign sequence appears within a 1,000-year window, then vanishes. You can start tracking how the system evolves. Do new signs appear, and old ones drop out like slang? Do combinations spread geographically over time, like memes moving along trade routes? That kind of temporal resolution is essential for any serious decipherment attempt. You don't treat a living, changing code as a single frozen language, so where does that leave us? Right now, the language hypothesis is plausible in a very broad, low-resolution way. It is plausible that these marks formed a conventional system with shared meanings. It is plausible that some combinations encoded structured information, time, place, quantity, life cycle, stage in a way that nudges up against what we might fairly call proto-writing. It is not, with current evidence, plausible to claim that we can read them in anything like the way we read Sumerian tablets or Egyptian tomb walls. We're operating in a zone of disciplined speculation. We can sketch what a decipherment would require. Lots more data, better dating, radically improved recording patterns that survive independent reanalysis, and ideally some external correlates. Seasonal bones, migration evidence that line up with what the symbols seem to say. Until then, every proposed translation is a hypothesis, wherein confidence it hasn't earned. But that doesn't make the hunt pointless. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because even if these marks never quite cross the threshold into full writing, the process of chasing that possibility forces us to sharpen our tools, refine our methods, and ask better questions about what information deep-time humans thought was so important they had to carve it into stone. And that brings us to where the mystery stands today, and what the latest research is, and isn't, actually claiming. So, let's pause for a second and take stock. We started with a simple, almost childlike question. If the same 32 symbols keep turning up in Ice Age caves from Spain to Turkey over thousands of years, did our ancestors quietly invent writing 20,000 years before Sumerian accountants ever pressed a stylus into wet clay? By now, that question should feel less like a yes or no trivia fact, and more like a not because on one side, the this really might be proto-writing case is surprisingly strong. You have a limited recurring sign set. You have evidence of non-random placement, particular marks gravitating toward particular animals, particular body zones, particular parts of caves. You have sequences, not just isolated doodles, and they show hints of structure, certain signs tending to cluster, to repeat, to appear in similar positions relative to each other. You have temporal depth. This isn't one eccentric group in one valley inventing a private code for a century and then vanishing. The repertoire persists and spreads across both space and time. Put that together, and you stand, well, no longer looking at random graffiti or purely individual expression. You're looking at conventions, shared habits, a codebook of some kind. And that nudges very close to how anthropologists define writing in the broad sense. Durable, standardized marks that carry agreed-upon meanings beyond the here and now of speech. On the other side, the pump, the brakes. This is not the first alphabet camp has powerful points too. 32 symbols over tens of thousands of years is actually not very much information. The strings are tiny by epigraphic standards. 2, 3, maybe 5 signs in a row. No long paragraphs, no obvious sentences, no dense clusters you can mine for grammar. We don't see clear, unambiguous evolution of the system the way we do with later scripts. No obvious stages where a sign set expands, splits, or gets repurposed in ways you can track like sound changes in language. And crucially, we have zero independent check, no bilingual, no attached objects with known functions, no matching oral tradition, nothing that lets you say if this interpretation is right. The bones in this pit should all be from spring kills, and then go dig and see. So both sides are leaning heavily on patterns, but patterns alone can mislead you. Human brains are ruthless pattern detectors. That's how we survived. It's also how we end up connecting constellations into animals and heroes, or seeing faces in as power outlets. The Ice Age symbol debate lives right on that edge, between real signal-bearing structure and Gogoro pose. What can we say without cheating? We can say that Upper Paleolithic people had a shared graphic vocabulary. That's not in doubt. You don't get the same 30-odd marks spread over continents and millennia unless some symbols mattered enough to copy. We can say those marks weren't purely decorative. Their restricted placement, their repeated pairing with very specific animals or panels, their tendency to avoid the most obvious make-it-pretty spots, all argue against them being simple ornament. We can say they likely carried information maybe about time, maybe about animal behavior, maybe about territory, ritual, or group identity. But something was being tracked, tagged, remembered. We can also say we're nowhere near a reading. Nobody can look at a panel in Lascaux and give you a line-by-line gloss the way they can with the Babylonian Kudurú stone. Anyone claiming that level of certainty is selling you more than the evidence can support. Beyond that, we're in degrees of plausibility, a minimal, cautious claim. These are part of a symbolic communication system that extends speech, probably in structured ways, but doesn't mirror language directly. A bolder claim, this is a genuine form of notation encoding recurring aspects of the world, seasons, migrations, life cycles, rituals in a stable, conventional way, prototyping in the same family as tally bones and early calendars. The extreme claim that this is the world's first full writing system, encoding the sounds and syntax of spoken language, is right now the weakest. Not impossible, just not where the weight of the data points. Because whether or not we award these marks the official title of first writing, the debate itself is telling us something important. It's forcing us to ask, how early did humans start externalizing thought? At what point did memory stop living only in brains and start being stored outside bodies in knots on cords, notches on bones, carved lines on cave walls? If the 32 symbols really do form a consistent notational system, then by 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, people were already offloading time, space, and animal knowledge into external media. That means their cognitive world wasn't just, I remember, and you remember. It was the wall remembers, the rock remembers, the symbol remembers for us. If, on the other hand, the marks are more ad hoc, powerful, meaningful but flexible, shifting from group to group, that still tells us something. It suggests Ice Age minds were comfortable living in a dense stew of symbols whose meanings were negotiated, contextual, layered. A dot next to a bison might be about hunting to one clan, initiation to another, a mythic event to a third. The same way a cross today can be a religious emblem, a decoration, or the sign on a pharmacy. In both scenarios, you're looking at people already thinking in abstraction, already capable of mapping invisible things, time, ownership, taboo, story, onto repeatable marks, already playing with the idea that a few strokes could stand for something that isn't there. That's the real heart of this argument. It's not just, did they beat the Sumerians to writing by 20 millennia, it's how far back does the story of our symbolic narrative future planning mind really go? And in the final stretch, that's where we're headed. We're going to set aside the label writing for a moment and ask if we look at these signs as windows into cognition. What do they show us about how Ice Age people saw time, animals, each other, and what they thought was so important they had to carve it into stone for someone someday to find? So, with all of that on the table, let's actually bite the bullet and answer the question we started with. Did Age hunters scratching 32 little signs into the dark invent humanity's first written language? The most honest answer, based on what we know right now, is almost certainly no. If by written language you mean a system that can capture the full flow of speech, sounds, grammar, word order, nuance, the way Sumerian, ununiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, or the alphabet can, but almost certainly yes. If by first step on the road to writing you mean a stable conventional system of marks used to store and transmit important information beyond any single moment or conversation, that's where the weight of the evidence really points. Those 32 symbols are probably not speech written down. They are probably the world written down. Not, this is how you say this sentence, but this is how the bison move. This is when the salmon return. This is who we are. This is what happened here. Think of them as the earliest surviving layer of something we now take for granted. Externalized information. Today, that looks like hard drives and spreadsheets and notifications on your phone. 30,000 years ago, it looked like lines, dots, Y-shapes, and little ladders tucked next to animals on cave walls. This is why the question matters so much more than a simple yes or no trophy for who invented writing first. Because whichever side you land on, the 32 signs are telling us that by the Upper Paleolithic, human minds were doing something radical. They were treating information as a thing, not just as words passing between mouths and ears, but as a resource you could stabilize, standardize, and move through time. That has huge implications. It means memory was no longer only biological, it was partly environmental. Knowledge lived not just in brains, but in marks. It hints that cognition itself was already distributed, shared between people, tools, and landscapes, in a way that prefigures everything, from knotted ink cords to modern cloud storage. It also forces us to rethink how culture scales. Once you have a conventionally agreed-upon symbol system, however small, you can layer meanings, time, ritual, identity, onto the same sign, stack memories across generations, as each group adds new panels or reuses old ones. Ship information across distance, because the same code works in a different valley. That's the seed of everything that comes later. Calendars, maps, property records, musical notation, mathematics, all the weird abstract machinery humans use to coordinate millions of strangers and build civilizations rests on this basic move. Let's take something in our heads, turn it into marks, and trust those marks to carry meaning for someone who isn't here yet. The Ice Age symbol system is probably one of the earliest clear traces of that move, and yet enormous questions are still wide open. Were those signs used in roughly the same way from Spain to Turkey? Or did meanings drift like dialects? Did people read them silently the way we read? Or were they always embedded in spoken performances, chants, stories, instructions that we will never hear? How rigid were the rules? Was there a right and wrong way to combine marks? Or was it more like jazz, shared themes, endless variation? Did every child learn this system as part of growing up? Or was it guarded knowledge taught to specialists, hunters, ritual leaders, keepers of time? And maybe the most haunting question of all, how much earlier did this story start? We're looking at what survived in durable media, carved into stone in protected caves. But how many years or tens of thousands of years did people spend playing with symbols in less permanent forms on skin, wood, sand, bark, before anything we can still see today ever dried or fossilized? Future research might nudge some of these from speculation toward answers. More precise dating of individual symbols, not just animal figures, could reveal whether particular combinations rise, spread, and fall like a fashion or a technology. Comparing sign orders across dozens more sites could show whether there really are sick-like constraints. Patterns of this never comes before that scream grammar. Residue analysis on the walls and floors might tie specific marks to specific activities. Seasonal butchery, gathering spots, initiation rituals, even advances in cognitive science. And AI could help by testing how much meaningful structure you can squeeze out of short symbol strings before you're just hallucinating patterns. And that's where you come in too. If this kind of deep time sleuthing lights up your brain, it really does help to nudge the algorithm in our favor. If you haven't already, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next dive into the strange, fragile beginnings of things we now consider obvious. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Are you in a city thousands of miles from the nearest cave, or somewhere not far from Ice Age sites people have actually dug? I love seeing how this little community of time travelers is scattered across the modern world. However you interpret those 32 marks, here's what we can say without overreaching. By the time someone stood in the flicker of torchlight and carved them next to a painted herd, the human mind had already crossed a threshold. We were no longer just telling stories. We were building systems, fragile, experimental, imperfect systems that could outlast any single voice. Was it the world's first true writing system? Probably not. But it may be one of the earliest surviving signs that our ancestors had begun recording their thoughts and leaving messages for the future. The ancient caves may be preserving that remarkable story.